Most bosses want to be good bosses. Hey, I am Chuck the Bureaucrat, and a while back, one of my subscribers asked me how to deal with, I'll say difficult bosses. And I feel a little guilty about how long it took me to respond, but it took time for me to collect my thoughts on this one. Because in order to understand difficult bosses and how to deal with them, you're going to have to understand two sort of philosophical points. First, I'll explain my universal theory of bosses. And second, I'll explain the hero's journey and how that fits into people's self-narratives. And finally, I gotta refresh you on two dimensions of the bureaucratic workforce that play heavily into the behavior of bosses. After we get all that set, we will be ready to dive into this question of how do you deal with a difficult boss. And there's one other secret I might share along the way, but I'd like to keep this as short as possible. Okay, first, my universal theory of bosses. You know how astrophysicists say that there is no true center of the universe? Or sometimes what people will say is that every point in the universe is the center of the universe. The reason they say this is because at the moment of the Big Bang, all space, time, matter, it was all squished together in a single point. And this single point wasn't just floating around in some kind of void. There was truly nothing else. So congratulations, you really are the center of the universe. Of course, so am I. So's your boss. So's that guy riding the subway with you. But in a very similar way, organizations are like the universe. They don't really have a center, and they don't really have an edge. Organizations have this strangely homogeneous quality, and that brings me to my universal theory of bosses. That is, everybody has a boss. Everybody has somebody who has the authority to tell them what to do and the ability to tell them whether or not they're doing a good job at it. Of course, there's different models. Sometimes your boss is a single person. Sometimes your boss is a set of clients. Sometimes there's thousands of customers or constituents, but you're not going to go anywhere that you don't have a boss. And that is true of everybody. So I have a boss. Your boss has a boss. That guy riding on the subway, he's got a boss. And in particular, your boss's relationship to his boss is going to influence the relationship you have with your boss. Okay, the second thing that's important to know if you're going to deal with difficult bosses is something called the hero's journey. Technically, this is a literary structure. If you watch a movie or you read a novel that focuses on a hero, they're almost certainly going to follow this pattern. A simple commoner who feels that they're somehow different than everybody else has a traumatic, often supernatural experience that serves as a call to adventure. They soon meet a helper who kind of gets them started. Shortly after that, they meet a master or a mentor who teaches them the things that they're going to need for the rest of their journey. And then they face a series of challenges. During this process, they usually put together a ragtag band of misfits as they plunge towards some pivotal abyss or revelation. This major event in the hero's story causes a transformation, and then the hero starts to right wrongs and atone for things they've done in the past. And then, by the end of the journey, they return home, transformed by their experience and often a master in their own right. Luke Skywalker follows this path. The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, they follow the template. Harry Potter, Huck Finn, Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, lots of Disney stories. And the Game of Thrones actually has multiple characters on overlapping paths. But the literary prominence of the hero's journey, that's not what's important in dealing with difficult bosses. What's important is that most people have an internal narrative of their life story in which they are the hero. So whenever you're dealing with anybody, whether they're your boss or not, or whether they're difficult or not, they are on the hero's journey. And you are a character in their story. You might be a helper or a mentor. You might be an obstacle or the big bad guy. But it's always important to keep this point in mind. Okay, the last element to cover before we get into my thoughts on dealing with difficult bosses is to consider two dimensions of the Pentagon bureaucracy. These are the different layers within the bureaucracy and the different employment categories. There are three layers to the bureaucracy. You've got the executive layer that makes decisions, typically general officers and senior executive service. You've got the action officers and the executive assistants, all working on specific issues, putting together packages that drive towards the executive layer for decisions. And between these two layers, you have the directors. And in the Pentagon, these are typically GS-15 civilians or O6s, colonels or Navy captains. The directors manage the flow of information between the action officers and the executives, usually with the goal of helping make the decision-making process smoother for executives. Tons of Pentagon activities function on this three-layer model, but we're not going to get into all of those right now. The other dimension of the Pentagon workforce that you have to keep in mind is the employment categories. Obviously, you've got a lot of military. You have government civilians, plus you have a considerable number of contract workers. Each of these categories has different, considerations that impact how they behave as bosses. Okay, as we move through this grid, we've got to ask four questions. Who is their boss? Where are they on the hero's journey? How can that make them difficult as a boss? And what can we do to improve the relationship? All right, let's start with the military executives, general officers. By and large, they're working for a more senior general officer, a political appointee, or a politician who actually got elected by the people. Regardless, a general officer's boss is very demanding and only accepts perfection. What's more, general officers are at a weird point in their journey. On one hand, they've made it. They're probably going to get inducted to their high school Hall of Fame. But on the other hand, they are very much in the abyss, engaged in that grand battle that will define their story. Obviously, this means that they themselves can be demanding and exhausting, but what's more important is they are not looking for some quirky, entertaining sidekick. They want a no-nonsense, get-things done, trusted companion. And they do not have time to build relationships with subordinates. In this situation, it's best to use an intermediary, one of those director-level people that the boss trusts. As an action officer, hopefully you're working for one of the trusted ones. If you're not, if your boss isn't in the inner circle, then use someone who is to help shape your products and make sure that you're providing the boss what he needs. Now, military directors are kind of funny. Here we're talking about colonels who are working for generals. And colonels tend to be at sort of a tricky point in their journey. There is a pivotal moment in a colonel's story, and I argue that it shapes a lot of their behavior, especially their behavior towards you. It all comes down to the question of, will they make general officer? Most don't. Some of them realize this and get past the grief and disappointment so that they can move on to that transformation into something new. These guys can be frustrating because a lot of times they don't care about the work anymore. They stop being that interface between the executives and the action officers. If you're working for somebody like this, don't fight them. Take whatever benefit you can from them, and they often like being cast in the role as the master on your journey. But for real leadership, look to the person who's filling the gap that they've left. The more difficult colonel to deal with is the one who's not going to make general, but is still in denial. These guys work like demons. They often believe that if they were just a little bit better, that they would get the nod. And a lot of times, they drag the people around them on this cursed quest. Bosses who are in this phase of their journey are prone to temper tantrums directed at their staff. And I would love to say that there is a straightforward way to deal with these people, but my experience has been that there is just not an easy button. All you can really do is recognize that they are going through grief. Help them as much as you can, but be careful that you don't get drawn into their mania. And be there when it starts to dawn on them that their future might not be what they thought it was going to be. Now, there is one weird kind of colonel to deal with, and that's the one who knows he's going to make general officer. These are usually colonels who are just waiting for confirmation. These guys often have an aloofness about their behavior. They tend to act like philosophers who are not concerned with the matters of the day. The way that these guys can be difficult is that they seem to want to separate the kinds of things they did as a colonel for the future work that they're going to have to do as a general. My sense is that as they experience this transformation, they tend to err on the side of not being concerned about details. And I generally just let them go because reality is going to hit soon enough. Okay, the last group of military people are the AOs. And here you run into a lot of people who are much earlier in their hero's journey. Many of them are experiencing the Pentagon bureaucracy for the first time, and that means they're running into new and unexpected obstacles. They can have a hard time differentiating helpers from enemies, and they often need a mentor, but they haven't found one yet. And so all of this kind of clumps together to contribute to making them difficult. Obviously, one of the ways you can mitigate this is by taking the role of helper, and particularly in steering them towards other helpers. You also might keep an eye out for a mentor, but I would be careful about being too obvious about that matchmaking. The other thing about having a lieutenant colonel or a major as a boss is that your employment category is likely to prejudice them against you. You can expect a certain level of distrust towards civilians and contractors, especially with military who've never worked with these kind of employees before. And that means you're going to have to work to build trust the same way you always do. Small acts of trustworthy behavior without ever claiming that you're trustworthy. All right, those were the military bosses. Now let's take a look at the government civilians. The journey that they are on is very different than the journey of the military folks. In many cases, they're prior military, and so their civilian work is part of that post-transformation atonement. And even when you're dealing with a career civilian who's kind of clawed their way up through the civilian ranks, they tend to be more, conservative. They don't create as much energy as the military do. They don't respond as aggressively towards crisis. And in general, what they work towards is a sense of stability. And I get it. That stability is going to look a lot like resistance to change, but that in and of itself is not what's going to make them difficult bosses. In fact, when it comes to civilian executives, the senior executive service, I've had the most difficulty with them when they don't generate stability. They either get wound up about something and then get the general wound up about it, or they slack on some kind of boring detail that doesn't get done, and then it turns into a crisis. If you have a boss like this, the trick is to project the stability that you need from them. Never be too excited, never be too surprised. Get the work done quietly and professionally. When it comes to director-level civilian bosses, one of the things that they do that causes friction, and this is whether you're military or civilian, is they will tell you not to do something. Or they'll be very demanding about something that seems completely unimportant. With these guys, it's important to remember where they are on their hero's journey. A lot of them, not all of them, but a lot, have been there, they've done it, and they're going to be here a long time after you're gone, still doing it. They're like Sherpas helping you climb Mount Everest. They conserve their energy, they do what needs to be done at the right time, and when you take foolish or rash actions, they hold you back. With these guys, do what they tell you. If you find that you have additional bandwidth, seek their advice on how to use it. And do not go behind their back making commitments that they might end up having to fulfill. The last group of government civilians are the action officers. And to be honest, I don't have enough experience working with them to understand what it's like to have them as a boss. Really, the same thing goes for contractors as bosses. But by now, you probably have figured out how I would think about this. Who's their boss? How can you help your boss satisfy the things their boss wants? And where are they on their hero's journey? I mean, a young civilian boss may not even realize that they're actually walking a well-trodden ancient path. A contract boss, even an older one, might be looking for the opportunity to take up the next challenge. And so the question is, how do you help somebody like that? Because at the end of the day, here is the big secret. People really care about their future. So if you can put the difficulties of the day into a context that leads to a brighter future, well, they start to seem a lot less like difficulties. Listen, this was a long video. I'm going to go get some coffee, and I'll talk to you guys tomorrow.